So, in World War One, you have soldiers being amassed by the millions, and this is one of the first times where you have just this many millions of men on, a singular front. They're not spread out as much, and you can get them anywhere. And that means that the supply lines that will give these soldiers food are at an incredible amount of strain. And World War One really sees a lot of new advancements in tech when it comes to food, and it's really fascinating to look at. But today we're not going to be looking at just like the technology of the food. We're going to be looking at what would you be eating if you were a soldier in World War One, and we're going to look at two nations, kind of a third, and it's gonna be good. So hope you enjoy it. So Britain in 1914, you will be getting enough food. You will have enough to the point that you will not starve, but it is not going to be gourmet food. It is not going to be food that you would want when you get back home, but it was enough that you can do your duties as a soldier day to day, which is really all it has to do. So, with my very handy drawing, we can see roughly how much of each item you would be given per day. Okay, so the average soldier in 1914, bear with me, this is so stupid, would be given about 1.25 pounds of fresh or frozen meat, but this could be changed to 1 pound of salt meat depending on what was available at the time. They would be given 1.25 pounds of bread, or 1 pound of biscuit and flour, depending on what was available at the time, and this would change later in the war. And this is roughly drawn to size, I promise, very roughly. You would be given 4 ounces of bacon, you would be given 3 ounces of cheese, 5/8 of an ounce of tea, because this is Britain. Every single nation in the war would have like a defining drink that they would get, which is really funny. Like French soldiers would be given wine instead of tea. British soldiers would be given beer instead of tea or wine. Like it's very easy to tell which nation you're coming from, the major nations at least, based off of what drink was included inside of your meal rations for that day. And then you have 4 ounces of jam. Now, we're going to talk about the jam a little bit more. So, this image on the screen here is a British soldier eating plum and apple jam with the caption at the bottom with the eternal question, when the hell is it going to be strawberry? And this is a widely discussed topic by British soldiers in World War One. When you are fighting with millions and millions of men, comfort foods kind of go out the window. Diversity of food goes out the window. It comes down to what can we supply and how can we keep our soldiers healthy. Everything other than those two thoughts is kind of an afterthought. And one of these things was this jam. Like it is, helpful to the soldiers. Morale improves. They get jam with their bread. But the secondary thought of, how do we diversify it and make it taste better is a little bit lower on the list. And this company would make plum and apple jam, and for years, soldiers would be given plum and apple. Except there was also supposedly a strawberry jam and a bunch of other flavors. But when you're in war, you don't focus on making a bunch of different ones. You focus on what works the best. What can you make the most out of? And plum and apple is what was on hand. And it just becomes this big point in the British Army among lower ranked soldiers about this plum and apple, which is really funny. And I just wanted to make a note about that. Now, coming back to this wonderfully drawn piece of paper, you have 3 ounces of sugar. You would be given 1/2 ounce of salt, 1/36 ounce of pepper, 1/20 ounce of mustard, 8 ounces of fresh or 2 ounces of dried vegetables. Now, during the war, vegetables would become very scarce to come by, especially later in the war, some nations harder than others. And to combat this, you would be given lime juice depending on how bad things got. Now, the British ration in 1914 stated that a soldier was to be given 1/10 gill lime juice if fresh vegetables were not issued. 1/10 of a gill, there is US and UK gills. 1/10 of a UK gill comes out to about 4 flow ounces in US conversion. I'm pretty certain. So not a whole lot, but enough that you would get barely enough nutrients to get you to the next day where hopefully you have actual vegetables, you know? But again, that's only if you do not have vegetables on hand. This is a last resort. Now, maybe you would be given 1/2 gill of rum. Maybe, but that was entirely dependent on if you had rum on hand and if the commanding officer was feeling like giving it out to soldiers. If you had some infraction, you would not get your rum. If the commanding officer didn't like you, he would not get your rum. Now, the other thing about the rum was that soldiers, on many accounts, would be given rum right before an attack. Like minutes before you go over the top, a soldier would be given like a swig or two of rum to calm their nerves, which I think is kind of interesting. Like you're about to go over the top and fight to death, but they're like, yeah, get buzzed first. I don't know. Now, there's also one other thing. They would be given up to, not exceeding though, 2 ounces of tobacco per week, but that was in 1914, so it changes. Now, they were given a secondary ration in a complement to their, rations that they get every day, and these would be called iron rations. These are extremely calorie-dense rations meant for emergency uses. You would not want to eat this, and you would only be eating this had something gone horribly wrong. And the iron ration is not like the photograph on the screen where it is iron rations on the side of a shell. Yes, that's iron, but no, not what you'd be eating. Now, let's say you go on the attack in the early morning hours, and you end up trapped in no man's land during the attack. And you can't crawl back to your lines in the middle of the day, because if you try that, you are going to get shot. So you have to wait the entire day before you can crawl back to your lines. Well, it'd be nice to have something to eat, especially if the trip from no man's land to your lines takes 2 or 3 days to crawl back. And this is where the emergency ration would come into play. You would eat that if you're trapped in no man's land. Maybe the supply lines have, been faltered or cut and you don't get food for a day or two. You would use emergency ration then. But again, only in extreme cases would you get this ration. Now, back to the piece of paper again. In your emergency iron ration, you would be given 1 pound preserved meat. This would be called bully meat. It'd be in a can. It was not tasty. Soldiers hated it, but it was enough to get you through whatever, emergency you were in. You would be given a 12-ounce biscuit, which we will get back to in a minute. It was not necessarily a biscuit that you would think of today from Cracker Barrel, where it's nice and soft. Wildly different. You would be given 5/8 of an ounce of tea, because even when you're in no man's land, you still need tea apparently. You would be given 2 ounces of sugar. You would be given 1/2 ounce of salt. You'd be given 3 ounces of cheese, and then 1 ounce of meat extract, which would equate to about 2 cubes of meat extract. Now, this biscuit on the screen here is called hardtack, and it is meant to be able to be eaten for extremely long periods of time. Like you could store this in like a nice, dark environment, and as long as nothing gets to it, it should survive for an extremely months, going on years. And that was perfect for this iron ration, but that does not mean that it was pleasant to eat. You would have to soak it with water to get it soft enough to the point that you could chew down on it. And it was also hard enough that if you took a pen or a pencil, you could carve a message into the side of the hardtack, like the image on the screen here, where an Australian soldier wrote a message to his darling wife on the side of his biscuit, and it is now in a museum. And this wasn't a one-off occurrence either. There are several different, exhibits of these trench art pieces of people engraving the sides of their biscuits because it was hard enough to do so. But again, it's just meant to get you out of the situation you're in back to a normal or more normal situation. Now, you also have the issue of, when they're normal rations, they get, 3 ounces of cheese and 4 ounces of bacon, but you don't just want a 3-ounce solid block of cheese every day, or you don't want 4 ounces of uncooked bacon. Like, you want it warm, right? And Early in the war, they figured this out pretty quick, and soldiers were given these extremely lightweight burners that could warm the food. Now, throughout the war, Germany faces a lot more hardships than what the Allies face with their food shortages. You have Germany not expecting a long war, right? You have this fast defeat plan on France and Russia. That doesn't happen. And now, overnight, basically, the nation loses about a third of all of its food industries because it relies on that through, imports. And because this blockade happens, they lose that. They lose a ton of their fertilizer, they lose a ton of their vegetables, and now suddenly you have famines starting to pop up over the next couple of years. By 1916, Germans faced one meatless day a week across the entire army. If it's Tuesday, it's too bad. You don't get any meat in your meal, which takes a significant toll on the soldiers, not just mentally, but also physically. Now, you also have, throughout the entire war, slow step downs of how much meat they're getting, even on the days that they get to have meat. You also have a lot more of a reliance on potatoes instead of bread throughout the war, because bread with the flour does not primarily come from Germany. But potatoes, which are grown in much more abundance than flour is, starts giving out more. So instead of having a 26 portion of potatoes, you'd be having a 30 or a 34. It would increase. Now, you have the food riots in 1917, where the German population starts to rely on turnips more and more and more because the flour and the bread and the potatoes are being sent to the soldiers on the front line. This is due to morale reasons. Mainly, it boils down to if the soldiers in the front line know that they are not getting good enough food because conditions at home are that bad, then what they are being told is not even scratching the surface of how bad it actually is. So you have to keep up the facade that everything is okay. Well, civilians back at home are relying on food pantries, they're relying on turnips, and it's getting really, really bad extremely quickly. And by spring of 1918, you have the daily rations in some places as low as half of tin of preserved meat, dry vegetables, and just a lump of ground up corn as bread. And soldiers' weights are dropping dramatically too because they don't get enough food. And you have civilians back at home dying in the hundreds of thousands due to famine. It really would not be a good time to be a German soldier in 1918. Not good at all. Now, I've talked about what food these soldiers are getting, right? Like you have 3 ounces of cheese and 4 ounces of bacon as the British, and you get all this, potatoes and bread if you're German. But the preparation for the food is a little bit more complicated than just a solid state burner that the British get. It really comes down to every morning the soldiers get all of these ingredients to some capacity, and then throughout the day they would be released to go to further back trenches, or if they're in the supporter reserve trenches, go to the cooking area. And like this photograph here, they would have it cooked there. And then it was more of like a platoon thing. Everybody in the platoon gives their food, and then everybody gets about the same equal proportion back. And then, that equates to roughly how much food they should have. And you have this mix of soldiers making their own food and preparing it on the front line to like giving it to these kitchens and then receiving a portion back. And it really just varies where on the front you are, what time of the front you are on, what position you are in. It really, really just changes fluidly depending on where you are. Now, there's 2 more things I'd like to talk about. And the first one is if you were an officer, you would see an incredibly different meal plan than what I have listed off. If you were a colonel or a major or any officer that's really above a lieutenant, and even then lieutenants would see a vastly different meal plan than what I just listed off, but they would see closer to that, you would see something wildly different. Even German officers in 1918 were still having full meals with meat and potatoes and all these other things because they're officers, and you treat officers better than enlisted members. It's how it's always been, it's how it always will be. I don't know. But, soldiers took note of this, and they would make songs about it. They would make poetry about it. They would make books about it because it's this big point of contention. One of the best, if not the best, song from World War I sang by soldiers is called Mademoiselle from Army Tears. And if you watch They Shall Not Grow Old, the documentary, which you absolutely should, during the end credits, it is that song. And in the song, there is a line, the officers get all the steak. And they are referring to the fact that the officers get nice, fresh meat while the British soldiers are there eating bully beef that has been canned and tastes horrible and looks like sludge for 4 years now. And it just varies wildly between just the average officer and the average enlistee way down here. Now, the other thing is that when America comes into the war and you have the full weight of the American industry and army behind it, the Americans come over and just blow Germany, France, and Britain's, food lines out of the water. The average American soldier is going to be eating a better meal than what Britain, France, or Germany can produce in 1918. They are having vegetables, they are having meat, they are having fresh bread, they are having incredibly good meals because America has the industry to support it and they haven't been bogged down for 4 years fighting an all-out war. And it shows, really just beginning of the war and end of the war, the capabilities of what a nation can produce. It's really fascinating to look at. And then again, you have other nations, Italy, France, Austria-Hungary also have just their own absolutely fascinating, rations that they would give out to their soldiers. But I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm kind of not going to talk about them. But key points for France, they get wine with their meals. Britain gets tea, and Germany gets beer, because it's how it's always been.